there. I'm Ariane Comstock, and today we're going to talk of one of the rare arts that opera delves into. You know that we have poetry, ballet, symphony, so forth in opera, but this time we're talking about archaeology because opera also tells us about history. Today's opera is Semiramide, also known in French as Semiramis, and in ancient, who knows what language, Shamurat. She was a legendary queen. But listen, you hear more about her. One of the interesting things about it is that the first time it was done in America was in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1867, I think. And Oscar Wilde was there.
No. Oh, wow.
Now, I mean, it's bizarre that the American premiere of Semiramide would be in Cincinnati, but it's even strange. What was Oscar Wilde doing in Cincinnati? My mother was born in Cincinnati. She said it was a great place to be from, far away from. Yeah. It was written in 1823, and as I have gotten into it, I find this fascinating backstory. I don't know if you are into archaeology, but I hope you will be by the time we're through. And the background of it is fascinating, and the opera itself, most people who went to it really liked it. So we're going to see a trailer, a quick 2-minute trailer, and then I'll go into the background of it. That's a bizarre, very bizarre staging, isn't it? I mean, you had, it's a mishmash with a little bit of it in uniforms and, I don't know. Anyway, that's not what you're going to see. What you're going to see is very beautiful production with gorgeous costumes and fabulous scenery and beautiful music, and it is long. How many of you have ever heard of Gilgamesh? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Good for you. The only time I had heard the name Gilgamesh was my daughter came home from school with 2 friends, boys, brothers, who were named Gilgamesh and Beowulf. McRae. You may go through life being called Gilgamesh, McRae, or Beowulf. I mean, that's really bizarre. And then a student in my classes on Homer last year gave me the Epic of Gilgamesh on audio CD, and you have got to listen to it. I have here the book, Gilgamesh, and it is so amusing that it's very short, because you can imagine when you were carving things on stone, you didn't use long words. And they were carving this in stone. But when the opera was written, they didn't know this. This was 1832, and they only discovered these tablets in 1967. What they had to go on was the words of the Greek ancient writer Diodorus and Herodotus, the Roman. So these were epics that they had been passed down in the Latin from that, and the librettist Metastasio, we'll talk about him later, was a Latin scholar and knew these stories. But the story of the Queen Semiramide has almost nothing to do with the story, except that she was, apparently, as the scholars believe, because they found a stela in Uruk that says that she was the wife of Shamsi Adaz. I'm going to start with Gilgamesh because it's fabulous. Gilgamesh was a hero in an epic story in Assyria, in Babylon. He, the son of Shem, I think, built the Tower of Babel. And Gilgamesh was descended from Shem. And in the epic is included the flood story, without the names, of course, of Noah or Shem, but just the story that Gilgamesh was the hero who came after the flood and built the towers of Uruk, which is the city of Erech, now they call it, and it still exists, and they have ruins, and they keep digging. Every year they make new discoveries. They dig under the ocean. I think it's fabulous. You know, they talk about outer space and going out there, and all they find are rocks. But when you dig in the earth, you're finding all these fabulous, interesting stories, and they have underwater wrecks where you can dive and look at these. It's just a really fascinating thing for me. And Gilgamesh has been picked up. That epic has been picked up by the gamers, who now there are a couple of them who use the name of Gilgamesh, the great hero, and you know they're fantastically huge. And Gordon, I think, has some pictures you will see of the gaming heroes as they envision them, but they are described in the epic exactly that way. Shamurat was the probable name of Semiramide, which in French is Semiramis. We spoke of that last week. She was called Shamurat in the old stories and in the stela that I talked about. She took over as the warrior queen, and she made war around this. Assyria is situated to the west of Iran, and when she got through, they owned all the territory west of Iran, north to the Caucasus, and south to Arabia. It's a huge territory. Mm-hmm. And she led battles against various countries, and she led one against Armenia because she heard that the king, whose name was Ara the Beautiful was his name, and she heard that he was so beautiful and was such a great warrior, she thought he would be a suitable king for her. So she thought, well, I'll conquer his kingdom, and then he'll have to marry me. Don't you like the way this woman thinks? So off they go, and unfortunately, Ara died in battle, but she didn't want Armenians to know that, so she dressed one of her soldiers as Ara, and but they discovered the ruse, so they didn't accept her as queen. So then she turned to India, and she made war against India, and she had she noticed the Indians had elephants, and everyone was terrified of the elephants. Not anyone would be. And so she had fake elephants made to make war against the Indians. And it worked for a while until they found out they were fake. And then she was wounded. I mean, she was these are fabulous stories that you get. Opera is so wonderful. Delving into the background of opera leads you into so many different paths. It's really enjoyable. She was said to be half goddess. She was the daughter of a fish goddess who had mated with a mortal and was so ashamed that she'd left the child by a stream like Moses in a basket, and the doves fed the baby. They heard the baby crying. I don't know how a dove can feed a baby. That's the story, and I didn't make it up. And so there you will see statues if you get to go through the Middle East ever, if the wars ever stop, and you will see statues of Semiramide or Shamurat, which is a name still used in Armenia and in parts of those parts of the world. And she's usually, there's a fish involved and a dove on her head. So that's, you'll recognize it right away and you'll think of Semiramide. She invented two very interesting things. One was the chastity belt. I don't know why she cared, but that's another story. And she was the first to make a young man into a eunuch. And that was the beginning of the eunuch slaves that they had, and which eventually leads into the opera, because we have castrati at the time that Metastasio wrote Semiramide. She appears in Dante, in the circle of hell, the circle of lust. That's interesting. And the opera was taken from a story by Voltaire. You remember we just studied Voltaire. And it has been set to operas by Cimarosa, by Meyerbeer, Calderon de la Barca, and Honegger has made a ballet of it. So, and there was a movie with Rhonda Fleming, The Queen of Babylon. You know that Babylon was the Hanging Gardens. We're familiar with the Hanging Gardens, and the second act is set in the Hanging Gardens, although I can't say I noticed anything. And the shining walls of Uruk are constantly mentioned in the Book of Gilgamesh. So now that brings us to the opera itself, which was written by Gioacchino Rossini. We have discussed Rossini at length, so I thought I would just briefly talk about him. If there's one man in history I'd like to have dinner with, it was Rossini, because he had the best food, for one thing. And he was a very funny man, a very witty man. He was born on leap year on the 29th of February. I won't make the old joke about how old he was. In 1792. And when he, in 1829, he had written, oh my God, I can't even remember how many operas, and he retired from writing opera. William Tell was his last opera. He wrote other songs called Péché de la vieillesse, Sins of My Old Age, which are very charming. He was just a very charming man. I will retell one story because I like it so much, that the nephew of Meyerbeer everyone had to visit Rossini. Verdi had to visit Rossini. Every musician in the world had to get Rossini's approval once he stopped composing, and he had kept a salon, a weekly salon where all the musicians and the artists would gather. And so Meyerbeer came to Rossini and he said, you know, I wrote a dirge for my uncle and I would like to play it for you. And Rossini said, please be my guest, go ahead. So he sat down and he played his dirge. And when he was through, he looked at Rossini, and Rossini said, yes, yes, very good, very good. But it would have been better if you had died and your uncle had written the dirge. There are loads of this about him. There's a book by Herbert Weinstock, which I recommend. If you read it, it's the best written. The other ones are very dry and scholarly, and his is full of fun. The librettis, you know, we never talk very much about the librettos, and I think you realized when we watched Tosca and we watched La Bohème, there's not a word that isn't really great, and it's so tight that it's hard to cut. You can't take excerpts without, you know, every moment is alive and every moment keeps you on the edge of your seat. He was so lucky, Puccini was so lucky to find Illica and Giacosa, who did his libretti, because they're all that way. It's wonderful. Verdi was not so lucky in the early part of his life. The libretti are just the same kind, this kind of a libretto, which are written, and this is what you must keep in mind when you listen to the opera, when you see it, is that it was written with the idea of hearing beautiful singing. It's bel canto. You know that Rossini was one of the three great bel canto composers. So what you're going to be hearing is just lots and lots of really beautiful singing. Don't expect the emotion that you get with Verdi and the power, or the tears you always get with Puccini. You'll be happy to know that I don't think you're going to be crying at this one.